His season, his debt, his future, all walked back in behind a stranger. The mortgage paper sat on the kitchen table for 11 days before I turned it face down. That's the kind of man I'd become, not the kind who deals with things, the kind who flips them over so he doesn't have to look at them while he eats his breakfast. I want you to understand that. I want you to understand where I was before I say anything else, because if you don't know where a man starts, you won't know what it cost him to finish somewhere different. It was October. The grass had gone the color of an old saddle, and the creek down the east fence had dropped to a trickle you could step over dry-footed. We'd had the driest summer in 14 years. People in town said so, strangers said so, the almanac said so, and none of that mattered a damn to the bank in Cheyenne that held my note. The calf crop was thin. Half the hay I'd put up was a gray, musty second cut that the steers turned their noses at. I'd sold 30 head at the wrong time because I needed the cash and had watched the price go up 2 weeks later like the market was laughing at me personally. My wife Doreen had been gone 4 years. Not dead, gone. Took our youngest, Marisol, who was 7 at the time. Left me a note on the same kitchen table that now held the mortgage paper. The note was 3 sentences. I don't remember all 3 exactly anymore, which tells you something about what the mind will do to protect itself. The one I remember is the middle one. You were already somewhere else long before I left. She wasn't wrong. I know that now. I knew it then, too, in the way you know a thing but refuse to hold it in your hands. So that October, I was 58 years old. The ranch was my grandfather's, then my father's, then mine 420 acres on the north side of a valley that sits between 2 low ridges in a corner of Wyoming nobody's written a poem about. I'd worked it since I was 12 years old in any capacity that would hold me upright. I'd mended fence in January sleet. I'd pulled calves at 2 in the morning with both arms in places God didn't intend a man's arms to go. I'd loved that land in the way you love something that will break your back and not apologize. And I was losing it. The number on the mortgage paper, the one I'd flipped over, was not the kind of number you make up in a bad year. It was the kind of number that meant I had until the 1st of December, which was 49 days away. And after that the land my grandfather had broken his hands on would belong to a bank in a city where nobody owned anything you could smell or touch. I was not making plans. I want to be clear about that. I was not making dramatic plans. I was just stopping, coming to the end of rope the way a horse does when it's run as far as the lead will let it and then stands there with its sides heaving, not pulling anymore. I'd eaten the same thing for dinner 9 nights in a row. Beans from a can and bread I wasn't bothering to toast. I'd let the truck go 2 weeks past its oil change. I'd stopped checking the fences on the south end. Small surrenders, the kind that add up. The morning she arrived, I was in the barn. I wasn't doing anything useful. I was standing at the back stall where I used to keep a quarter horse named Decker who died in July, colic, fast, nothing I could have done, and I was just standing there looking at the empty stall. The halter was still hanging on the hook beside it. I hadn't moved the halter. I don't know what that was about. Probably nothing. Probably something. I heard boots on the gravel outside, and then she was in the doorway. And the morning light was behind her, so I couldn't see her face right off. What I could see was that she was carrying a duffel bag over one shoulder and a paper sack in her other hand, and she was looking at me the way a person looks at someone they've been sent to find. "Callum Prout," she said. Nobody called me that except people who didn't know me, and my mother when she was unhappy with me, which was often. Everybody who knew me called me Cal. "Who's asking?" I said, not a question, just what came out. She stepped inside. She was maybe 40, 42. Brown hair pulled back hard, a face that had been weathered by something, not sun, not wind, something internal. Sharp cheekbones and eyes that were a color between green and gray that I didn't have a word for. She was wearing a canvas coat that had seen better years and boots that were broken honest, not broken for show. "Marta Ennis," she said, "your brother sent me." My brother Vince lived in Fort Collins and we talked on the phone twice a year and saw each other less than that. We were not close in the way that matters. I said, Vince doesn't send people. He did this time, she said. She set the paper sack down on a hay bale. He said you'd look at me like I was something the dog dragged up and tell me to turn around. He said tell you he called 3 times this month and you didn't answer. He had, I'd let it ring. What'd he send you for? I said. She looked at the empty stall, then back at me. He said you lost your horse. Colic, I said. July. He said you lost other things too. I didn't answer that. She reached into the paper sack and pulled out a coffee thermos, one of those wide ones, the kind that holds enough for 2 people, and she held it out and said, "There a place we can sit down?" We sat on the tailgate of my truck. She poured the coffee into the 2 cups she'd brought nested inside each other. It was good coffee, dark, none of that thin, watery stuff. I noticed that. You notice small things when you've stopped noticing most things. They stand out like stones in a dry creek. She said Vince had met her at a church social in Fort Collins 6 months back. She wasn't from there. She'd been working a property up near Laramie, managing books and equipment for an operation that had since sold out from under her. She'd grown up on a ranch outside of Sheridan. Her husband had died 3 years prior, cattle truck accident on an icy road outside of Buffalo. She had no children. She'd been putting together the next thing, and Vince had mentioned his brother and the ranch, and she'd said she knew something about ranches in trouble, and Vince had said maybe she should come see about it. I said, Vince doesn't have the right to send someone. Probably not, she said. I came anyway. Why? She looked out across the yard, at the dry grass and the gray sky pressing down on the ridgeline. Because I know what it looks like when someone's standing in an empty stall, she said, and I know what it means, and I don't think it's any of my business, but I came anyway. I didn't say anything. She didn't push. We drank the coffee. She didn't ask to stay. She said she'd camp in her truck if I didn't want her in the house. I told her she could have the spare room. It wasn't charity. It was cold and I wasn't an idiot. The first thing she did, the very first morning, was go through every box and drawer in the office off the kitchen, the room I'd stopped going into in September because of what was in it. She didn't ask permission. She just went in there with a yellow legal pad and a pen and started writing things down. I stood in the doorway and watched her and didn't stop her because something about the efficiency of it, the lack of drama, made it feel like she was doing something necessary rather than something invasive. By noon she had a list. She sat across from me at the kitchen table with the mortgage paper still face down between us, and she went through it. The hay situation could be fixed. She knew a man in Torrington with second-cut alfalfa he was trying to move before the snow. Not cheap, but not ruinous. The steer situation, the 30 I'd sold early, was done. No undoing it, but she thought I had 22 I could carry through the winter if we managed the feed right. The mortgage number she looked at for a long time. She picked the paper up from the table, read both sides, set it back down. She said there was a federal emergency drought loan program she'd used at the Laramie operation. The paperwork was substantial but not impossible. She asked if I had the records it would require. I said I didn't know what records I had. She said, then we find out. She said we. I noticed that too. I'm not going to tell you it was easy or that she came in and fixed things with some kind of magic I didn't have. That's not what happened. What happened was she worked. I mean, she worked. She was up before me, and she knew her way around a ranch the way you only know it if you were raised on one, not performing competence, but just doing things, the right things in the right order without announcement. She backed the tractor out of the shed, checked the hydraulics, and told me the rear seal was weeping and needed attention before the ground froze. She was right. I'd been ignoring it. She patched the southwest fence line in a cold wind one afternoon, and when I came out to help she handed me the wire stretcher and we worked side by side without talking, and it was the first time in months I'd felt like I was doing something that mattered. She cooked real meals. Not for me specifically, she just cooked. She'd make enough for two and put it on the table and there'd be food there. I hadn't eaten a real meal since August. I hadn't realized what that was doing to me until I started eating again and felt the fog lift a little. Sounds small. It wasn't small. The records she needed were in boxes in the office closet, shoved back behind a broken space heater and 2 years of seed catalogs. We went through them together over 3 evenings. She would call out what she needed and I would look, and 9 times out of 10 I could find it, because I'd kept everything even when I didn't know why. She said that was in my favor. She said a lot of banks refused these loans because men let the paperwork go. She said I hadn't let the paperwork go. I just stopped looking at it, which was a different kind of problem and a fixable one. On the 3rd evening I said, "Why are you doing this?" She was holding a quarterly tax summary from 2 years back, looking it over. She said without looking up, "I told you. Your brother, Vince, told you about a ranch in trouble," I said. "You drove 200 miles. She put the paper down. She looked at me across the box lids and the scattered folders and the lamp that was throwing yellow light onto the wall behind her. "I've been looking for something worth working on," she said. "That's the honest answer. I've been in between things for long enough that I needed something real to put my hands on." She paused. "This is real." "The ranch might not survive," I said. "I know that. You might do all this, and it might not be enough." "I know that too." I said most people wouldn't come. She said I'm not most people. Not hard about it, just a fact. The loan application went in on November 3rd, 26 days before the deadline. The man in Torrington had the alfalfa, and we drove up together in my truck to look it over and negotiate. Marta walked the stacks and pulled samples and smelled them and tested the moisture with her thumbnail and offered him a price that was firm and fair, and he took it. We loaded out that afternoon. On the drive back she had her boots off. She'd gotten them wet crossing the man's muddy lot, and her sock feet were up on the dash, and she was reading the delivery receipt, and I looked over at her once and then looked back at the road. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that wasn't too large. November moved the way November does in Wyoming, heavy and gray and cold, that comes in under the doors no matter how good the weather stripping is. I got the tractor seal fixed. The steers were fed and holding weight. The fences were tight. The application was in, and there was nothing to do but wait. We fell into a kind of life. Not romantic. I want to say that clearly because it wasn't, not then, not yet. It was just 2 people doing the work of one property together. But there was something else in it. A steadiness I hadn't had in a long time. She knew when to talk and when not to. She knew when I needed to be left alone with a thing. She never tried to fix the fact of Doreen or the fact of Marisol or the fact of the 4 years I'd been chipping away to nothing out here alone. She just was there, in the way that matters, in the way that most people aren't. One night I heard her up late. It was after midnight, and she was at the kitchen table with a mug of tea going cold, and she was writing a letter on paper, actual paper, envelope beside it, and she had a look on her face that I recognized because I'd worn it myself. The particular look of a person holding up a weight nobody else can see. I put the kettle on without saying anything, and when it was ready I poured her cup fresh and set it beside her and went back to bed. In the morning she said, "Thank you for that." I said, "Don't mention it." She didn't mention it, but something changed. The loan came through on November 22nd. Not the full amount, 2/3 of what I'd asked for, but with what I had and what we'd already managed on the feed and the steer costs, it was enough. It was enough by a margin I won't pretend was comfortable, but it was enough. I was at the table when the letter came. I read it twice. Then I put it face up on the table, face up, not flipped over, and I sat there for a minute. Marta came in from outside, stomped her boots on the mat and looked at my face. She didn't look at the letter first. She looked at my face. "Well," she said. 2/3, I said. She took her coat off and hung it on the hook. She came to the table and picked up the letter and read it and put it back down. She did some math in her head. I could see her doing it, her eyes tracking, and then she nodded. That works, she said. Barely. Barely is enough, she said. Barely keeps the land. I put my hands flat on the table. They were shaking a little. Not much, enough that I noticed. She noticed too. She came around the corner of the table and she sat down in the chair beside me, not across from me, beside me, and she put her hand over my hands on the table. Just rested it there. Not a performance. Not a moment from a story. Just her hand on mine and the sound of the wind off the ridge and the smell of her canvas coat still cold from outside. I don't know how long we sat like that. Long enough. She stayed through December. Into January. She didn't announce that she was staying, she just didn't leave. I asked her once in January, when the snow had come in hard and we were snowbound for 3 days and had to dig the truck out twice. I asked her if she had somewhere she needed to be. She looked at me from across the kitchen table. It was early morning and the light was thin and white coming through the window. She had her hands wrapped around her coffee mug. Do you want me to go? She said. I said no. She said, then I'll stay. Not a declaration, not a romance from a book, just two people who had both been somewhere cold for too long, finding the same warm room. In March, she went back to Fort Collins for a week to collect the last of her things. I didn't ask her to. She offered. She drove up on a Tuesday, and when she pulled back in on Friday evening and I heard her truck on the gravel and went out to help with her boxes, she had 3 of them and they fit in the spare room, and then some of them didn't need to fit in the spare room anymore. Spring came slow that year. It always does in that valley. The snow went off the ridges in patches. The creek came up. I watched the grass come back green along the creek bank, that particular bright early green that lasts about 2 weeks before it hardens into summer green, and I thought about my grandfather coming to this land and what he must have felt looking at it the first time. I thought about my father. I thought about the 11 days I'd let that paper sit face down. Marta was out by the near fence one morning, walking it the way she walked all the fences, systematically, not hurrying hand, running along the wire at intervals. She had her hair pulled back the same way she had it the morning she stood in my barn doorway with the light behind her. I watched her from the porch. She knew I was watching. She didn't perform for it, she just walked the fence. She turned at the corner post and looked back at me across the dead grass starting to green again, and she looked at me the way, I don't have a lot of words for this part. She looked at me the way no one had looked at me in a very long time. Like I was the thing she'd been looking for when she drove 200 miles on a cold October morning to find a man standing in an empty stall. Like I was worth the drive. I lifted a hand, she lifted one back. Then she turned and kept walking the fence, checking each post, doing the work. I went inside and made the coffee.